I think Patrick was sort of hitting on that when he was saying they're going to help make sure that the questions or the information is there that answers those questions. Those were questions that came up from when we were talking about all those scenarios. So just a way to look at, okay, this is the information we got. Does it answer these questions? Does it?
And I guess as I think about it, so each one of these questions, and I think Krista alluded to the fact there may be others that need to be added, each one of these questions and each one of the scenarios that are going to be studied have a context that they came up in, and to have people that were part of the process to understand the context that produced the questions as we're sort of trying to get something up and running and studying these and producing a report that can make sense to the board, felt important to keep the context in mind. And I don't think you're on the wrong track, Dave, in terms of there is an interest in keeping the community engaged throughout this, and that it plays that role to an extent too, I think, and that's not an unimportant role.
Thank you.
So Dave, this is the sugaring down of all the things we've been doing since October, and the charge that we have on this says that the answers we get from the questions we've asked about the scenarios might lead to other questions or other scenarios. So this is not etched in stone. This doesn't mean that the information we get back is terminal. It just means this is information. And this is all the conversations that we've had sugared down into this paragraph. So the community created this, and it's not the terminal event of the entire process.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Yep.
I guess, so these are the questions during our last day retreat with administration that we kind of come to this stumbling block, and we had all these, we were divergent, we had all these questions. And this is the synopsis of those questions, if I remember correctly. I agree with Krista's point that we should also consider the scenarios and the various pros and cons developed about those. And I have caution about other inputs that probably we should not hide underneath a rock, but we should be clear where all these inputs come from. This comes from board's administration retreat. The scenarios come from a development of the board and administration, and then we have these continuing comments from the community that somehow get filtered in that have merit, but they should not be construed as being developed through some of the other processes, in my opinion. And then Steve kind of alluded to who does the selection of the consultants, and it's a fine line between means and ends, but the board ultimately will have to go out and pitch the solution, and it would be important, I think, for the board to be able to say, yeah, we were involved in hiring these people, we were involved in working with these people, and here's our recommendation because we believe all this information because we were involved in it. So I don't know, and I'm not saying it's going to be, okay, here's everything set here and pick it up from there, but it seems like there should be some, as this committee folds together, there should be some assessment or understanding or rationale or, whoa, let's stop and think about this as to where we're going to go with assistance through consultants or whatever. Because once you go down that path, you know the path narrows as you go down it.
Is it helpful if I share an update on just what little bit of progress has happened so far? There's nothing that couldn't be turned around at this point, but so I had an opportunity to share this with the Community Engagement Committee the other day because the conversation kind of went down the path of the consultants and that study. what's happened so far is, so I've been in communication with the other superintendents in Addison County, because part of what has surfaced through these conversations was wanting some information, certainly specific to MAUSD, but also looking for opportunities outside of MAUSD in Addison County. So in conversation with those other superintendents, Addison Central is well down the path of facilities studies. They've already contracted with an architect. They have studies, etc. Addison Northwest was not that far down the path. They're sort of in the similar place that we are. And so in talking with those superintendents, and specifically with the superintendent in Addison Northwest, we thought it made sense to work with the same consultant as we look to what are our needs specifically within the boundaries of MAUSD. They would get information about specifically within the boundaries of Addison Northwest, and we'd want some information about what opportunities may present if we looked cross-district in those two districts, and could we work with a contractor that could look at the work that was done in Addison Central and feed that into something that may be a county-wide perspective. In talking with Addison Northwest superintendent, she had experience with a group called the New England School Development Council. So they're a not-for-profit organization that works around New England doing these kinds of studies for public schools. What an advantage I thought, so part of what you get with working with an architect group, no offense, Steve, you get the numbers for the most part, right? You get info, you get the numbers. What might be missing from that is sort of an educational programmatic lens. The New England School Development Council is run by mostly retired superintendents. So we get the same sort of data, the figures and the facts, with a lens of programmatically what makes sense for kids, which feels like ought to be a critical piece of the information that we're collecting. Ultimately, that's what we're striving for, is how do we provide strength in programming given our fiscal constraints with the facilities that we have and what makes sense there. So we've had an initial conversation with the New England School Development Council, and it was a very positive conversation, and their costs will be considerably less than if we worked with an architect. So everything so far in these early stages it's making sense that this is the group that we work with to get the study that we're looking for. And that's sort of where we are.
Dave?
So I have to be upfront about why I wanted to be on this board, and that is and I wrote an editorial to this effect. You know, I was part of creating Act 46, and all the testimony we took, virtually all the testimony we took, was about how small schools survive better in a larger family, how the cost reductions were going to be in administration and personnel. We are an outlier as a state. We're an outlier not just by a little bit, by a dramatic amount with regard to superintendent, what do they call it, district administration, and also building administration. And yet, this is a good example that there isn't a consideration here of what about the possibility of moving the superintendent's office into the high school. It's just an example of how the administration of this district might be modified to face the demographic crisis that we're facing in this district and in this state. If you're always looking, as all 3 Addison County districts did, at closing schools, when 80% of the cost of running a school is in personnel, it concerns me greatly that we're not addressing the problem the way we ought to be addressing the problem, and that this whole list has nothing with regard to administrative costs is concerning to me.
So Dave, could I speak up? So we've been talking about that for months, and I'm sorry you weren't at all the meetings. So once we know which buildings we are going to have, we are going to put the superintendent's office in one of those. we don't have it on there because we need these questions answered in order to get more specific and complex in some of those decisions. So that it might not, every question we have isn't on there, but we thought those were the ones that the consultant could help us with. I don't know if in the scenarios is us possibly merging with another district. So everything's on the table, and I don't, we've been talking about that every meeting. How can we downsize everything? We let go of 12.5 employees this year through attrition. We didn't have to cut anyone. And we're gonna get to the point, I think the main problem here is number of students that we're losing, not how many administrators we have, although that we're looking at cutting that possibly too. The thing that's making us have to look at closing buildings is losing students. I mean, right now, New Haven has 4 classrooms. Some people want to keep every school open. I understand that from a heart perspective. So some people ask me, are you guys going to do a bond for Mount Abe this year? And I said, well, we don't know what we want Mount Abe to do yet, so we can't figure out, or if we're even going to have Mount Abe, so we can't do a bond for it yet. We have all these questions that we have to answer before we get more specific about where's the administration going to be? Do we even need Mount Abe? How many administrators do we need? So again, we didn't want to make any of those decisions without more information, if that helps.
Kevin.
So, I think the other thing, unfortunately, the thing Krista brought up and I reinforced about the scenarios talks a lot about consolidation of the administration. I think that's a foregone conclusion. These 6 scenarios, if you were debated at retreats twice, at meetings. The last retreat, we kind of became divergent and all these questions come up. And they got anchored into this thing without the basic information, which needs to be at least people brought up to speed informally if it's not attached to this. I think the whole thing is, yeah, everybody knows 80% of the budget, 75% of the budget is labor. But that labor is not all administration. That labor is everybody from pushing the broom to the superintendent. And as we realign this, you look at that whole labor pool. You don't look at just administration, because actually, when you get right down to it, that's a relatively small sliver. And it may not have been deliberate with Act 46, but it's coming anyway, and is going to continue to come. Is the fact that we're underutilizing space, and there's a declining student population.
So I appreciate the fact that there's an assumption that administrative costs are going to be part of whatever we go forward with in these scenarios. It's unfortunate it's not stated here.
So that's a piece that we're going to add in. I'll add in the scenarios as they're written in another document. I'll pull them from that and plug them right into this. They've been spread out several times, or shared with the community engagement group several times, so there's some basics understanding.
The minutes from the meetings.
Right.
Can I make a connection to policy governance too, as we're trying to develop understanding in that as well? So when we think about budget, so we're talking about different ways of spending money. Dave's talking about costs, like so number of administrators, et cetera, positions, and where costs go. Under policy governance, so the board determines what budget gets put before the voters, a dollar amount. The voters get to say yes or no to that. But the board under policy governance doesn't determine how those dollars get spent. That gets into the means, and that's what I'm charged with as superintendent, is to get these outcomes for kids that are described in the ends by any means necessary using this budget that the board put before voters that got approved. And so it's, as we start talking about how those dollars get spent once they're approved, obviously closing a school, things like that, and that actually isn't the board's authority either, that's the community's authority, the way our structures are set up. It's just important to, I think, keep that in mind.
This is Krista. I was just wondering if in the charge or in thinking about this committee's work, we can think about the community engagement piece. And I don't know if that means that someone from that committee should be on this committee, or that there's just good communication back and forth between the two groups, but that seems like a really important piece as well.
I'm making a note of that.
Okay, thank you.
So, how would you like to handle, do you want me to add in the pieces that you've mentioned? And you want to look at it again before you approve it next week? But that just shortens the amount of time when people could contact about wanting to be involved. It just takes a few days off of, well, a week off of the, or the 3:30 deadline.
I would support it with those additions.
Does this charge need a schedule?
I specifically didn't put a schedule in because it's gonna revolve around the people who helped with the study, and I thought if there was a schedule, that might eliminate somebody who might be able to help us because they couldn't fit the schedule.
I also think we're in pretty unusual times right now. So in that initial conversation with our with the New England School Development Council, they said what's really important, and it makes sense, is that when they're doing their study, that they're seeing the buildings with kids in the buildings, so they get a sense of the current use as they think about capacity and possible future use. I can't tell you today, the next day, our kids will be in our schools. I think there's a chance that our students don't return this school year, which means the study can't be completed before the board's August retreat, which was what we were hoping for. And so that might mean we're into next year now, in the fall sometime, before the board can have this. So our timeline that we set up this past summer, I think, is definitely in question now in light of everything.
I'm comfortable with voting on it with the changes we talked about. This is Krista, but also it sounds like urgency may not be a factor. So, it might not hurt to have it be finalized before we vote. So I could go either way.
Kevin?
If there's a consensus that we can vote on it based on modifications, I would say the sooner we're organized, the sooner we start thinking about it, the sooner the discussion is, the better off it's desirable. And yeah, we're going to be delayed by certain gates, but it doesn't mean that the whole, there's certain, I gotta believe there's things that can be done organizationally at least beforehand. I come from an environment that the quicker you do things, the better off you're going to be to go to the next problem, if you will.
I think we're there.
So those other problems keep coming, don't they? They don't stop until you solve this one.
Yeah, I'm fine with the thing as long as we put the background history in it.
Okay, so your options are to approve the charge with the modifications, and the modifications would be add the scenarios and the other questions, add the piece about appointing a chair to this committee. Or you can table it until next week and I can make the changes and bring it to you and you can look at it next week. Because we have a regular board meeting next week.
I don't think a week makes that much difference.
You need a motion?
I need a motion for one of those two things.
I make a motion for option 1.
Okay, so to approve.
I second that motion.
All right.
Sarah McLean.
All right. So, any further discussion? Kevin?
I would like to amend the motion to also develop an interface with the communications committee, whether it's by direct board support or some other form of liaison.
Don, I'm having a difficult time hearing Kevin.
Oh, so I would like to amend the motion to also include an understanding that this committee will work with the communications committee either through a direct representative or some other established liaison.
Yeah, you're gonna have to repeat that, Don.
Okay, so Kevin's amending the motion and he's stating to develop an interface with the Community Engagement Committee, either through a direct representative from that committee on this committee, or establishing a liaison to go between the two committees to keep the communication line open and collaborative. Is that?
Yes.
Did everybody hear it?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know how complicated we need to make this. I'm assuming we probably have an update at each of our monthly boards from this committee.
Right.
And I know that I went and sat in the Community Engagement Committee meetings a couple of times, even though I wasn't on them. So it's certainly possible that anybody in that committee could come join the meeting at their discretion.
I'll withdraw the amendment.
Okay, he's withdrawing the amendment. All right.
It's a pretty small group. We communicate pretty well.
All right, any more discussion on the charge? Okay, all those in favor of approving the Facilities Study Committee charge with the modifications of adding the scenarios and the other questions and adding language about appointing a chair, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Motion passed. Okay, the next item is an action item that I actually put on here in hopes that we could do a little board work around a possible language change on policy 4.4, school board chair's role. So you can.
Excuse me, Don,
Yes.
can people that aren't speaking put their device on mute? That will really eliminate background noise.
Okay, does everybody hear that? If you're not speaking, will you put your mute on? Okay. So you can find 4.4, the policy on the website. And if you want to look at our last monitoring report of that, you can go to the website as well and look under district reports and scroll down to the 2019 year and find the report from November of 4.4. So if you want to refresh your memory. I thought this might be a way for us to work through a possible language change on a smaller piece of policy, one that isn't so big that we might be all able to have a conversation.
Yeah,
I
just
just,
gonna,
is there any chance in the future when we refer to a policy that we can link to it on the agenda?
Yes.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So, rather than have a motion to revise the policy without even having the discussion, I'm gonna have us relax the rules a little bit just so we can have the discussion and come to a decision together before we have to figure out what the decision is. So, that is the board chair's role policy, and when I reported it in November, there were a couple of statements that I'm wondering if they don't warrant some change to the language.
so do you wanna go over those
So
statements?
So one of the comments that was 2 years in a row was that the board chair should not do the report. That report. I did it 2 years and that was 2 comments. I'm wondering if you believe that that's something that we should address in narrowing the policy a little more with that, with a statement to that effect.
Just saying that the board chair shouldn't do the
Yes, because
report on that?
two
Shouldn't do the monitoring report.
shouldn't, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. The other comment was a request to copy correspondence to the whole board when I speak on behalf, or when the board chair speaks on behalf of the board in a positional statement, or and that's really not covered in the language. That was just comments made. So my question to everybody is that something that needs to be added to the policy language, or is it just a comment kind of thing?
Don, can you give us an example of when this would apply?
The copying board members, that piece?
Yeah, like something that you would be expressing
So
as a voice of the board, and which we wouldn't be privy to because we haven't been copied on that correspondence.
So I might have a reporter who sends a message to me to give a statement about somebody who's newly hired in the district. What do I have to say? Normally, I just respond on behalf of the board, and I don't copy anyone else. So according to these comments, I've been feeling lately like, oh, if I do a response like that, I should immediately then go back and forward the message on to all the board members so everybody knows what I said, kind of thing. Now, the policy language doesn't really say that I have to do that, but I know that some members expressed an interest, so I'm torn between, it's not really in the policy, but I know they want to hear about it.
So I have a question, this is Andrew. Is this about, this is what the board wants and just are we codifying it in the policy, or we're still having a discussion of whether or not you should be forwarding that email to us?
Well, I think it's a discussion about, I've heard it said, and so, but it's not in the policy, so technically, if I'm reading the policy, I don't really have to tell you I have the authority, but do you want the policy to say, let us know, kind of thing, or? And I just thought this was an easier topic to have a discussion about. Do we change the policy? Do we keep the policy the same? Is it, because you find that the interpretation is reasonable, and you find that the data demonstrates the interpretation. So
Andrew again. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you go, Kevin?
No, go ahead.
go ahead.
I'm just thinking that sort of like how we, through policy governance, delegate authority and then limitations to Patrick, that sort of as we've designated you the chair of the board, that in my opinion, we designate you some authority to speak on behalf of the board, and I don't necessarily need to know every single time it happens. That's my perspective.
And then I was going to say pretty much the same thing, that, you know, we're looking at ends and weeds, or means. And, you know, some of that stuff doesn't seem to make sense to clog up email boxes with. And it may not be true with every chair, but I think anything of importance, you've always communicated out to the board.
Mm-hmm.
And the minutia, you know, personally, I'm okay with seeing the board chair said in the Addy Indy this, if it's like, you know, we hired this guy and I'm excited, or this person, I'm excited about it, you know. So I have mixed feelings, because once you put that in there, okay, I went out for a walk today. You know, you can take it to that degree.
Yeah.
And going back to the other one, I think just from an auditing point of view, quality control auditing, it should be separate. But I think with this one here, that maybe we should just let it go personally.
All right.
I know I think I'm the one that actually brought this up, and it just occurred to me that we do delegate the authority for you to speak on behalf of the board. I just know there's a couple of times I've been a little bit surprised to find that you've been dealing with an issue. You know, something's come up, and then there's been a fairly complicated conversation about it with somebody, and it usually sort of floats to the surface at some point or another. And it just occurred to me to ask, you know, is it something where when you find you have the need to execute that authority, is it something the rest of us either should know about, or maybe there's some place where it's stored where we could go look at it if we wanted to, but you don't necessarily have to worry about whether or not you've distributed every single piece of it. And I know we talked about, you know, where do you draw the line in these conversations? Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of them are very detail specific over something that's very minor, and it's a back and forth, and you're just redirecting somebody to go talk to somebody else. And obviously none of that really needs to be, you know, part of some sort of official record. So I don't have any strong feelings about it. It just was something that occurred to me when I was, I think I was seeing an email, probably with the Addison Independent on it last year at some point, and wondering if there was any need to, you know, be more general about distributing more official kind of board position statements.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. I think the action is no action.
Yeah, I think that's probably appropriate from my perspective. I think it's something that could be monitored. Yeah. It's just part of the monitoring report.
Yeah. Well, I felt like it was an easy way to have a discussion about, do we need to look at the policy? Is it not doing what we want? And where it's not a giant subject. Because if we want to consider at some point changing a policy, adding something to the ends policy, we're going to have to practice little bites to get to the big stuff.
I think one thing that might be important to come out of this is having it be possible for board members to understand what comments have come up on policy, in monitoring reports and on policies in the past. So if I'm doing say the next person that does the chair monitoring report wants to look at kind of a history of the discussion of comments that have come up in the past, where is there a place where we've got those recorded?
Right. So since all board members do a part of the monitoring reports for the board stuff, they're in Google on Drive, there is a file called Policy Governance where you can go back and look. You click on Policy Governance and then it's report, and it has the years, so you can look back, and the sheets I signed and where I gather everybody's comments are there, so you can see them all there.
That might be a good instructional thing to go through at some point.
Okay.
Don, I'm wondering if there's a benefit to having an action that says that the board chose not to revise the policy. That'd be something that could be referred back to at some point down the road if that was useful.
If someone was inclined to make that motion, to make no revision to the policy?
So moved.
All right, Andrew?
I'll second.
Is that Steve?
Yeah.
Okay, any further discussion? All right, all those in favor of no revision to 4.4 school board chair roles policy, please say aye.
Well,
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
you mind if I throw one question in?
Sure.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Did we decide the language about the, having somebody else do the report?
No, we did not. No, we did not. But at that last meeting, Kevin, I think Kevin and I are going to switch.
Okay,
Oh, thank you.
we'll just do that as kind of a,
That's the way I took it at the last meeting, that Kevin and I are switching monitoring
It's
report.
paid
And
then.
I feel like we maybe talked about when the time comes for the board work plan,
Right,
where
just
those are assigned, we'll
somebody
change it.
else will sign up for it.
yeah, just administratively, not in policy.
Right. Right, so, all
Sorry
right,
about that.
all right, so I got all those in favor, all those opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so it's done.